massive. This is officially a refugee camp remix. Home with it!
That song is the start of a song written by people who lived in a refugee camp. World migration from refugee camps and other causes, especially African and Middle East migration, have become a world social issue. In this podcast, Jennifer Breidenbach, who teaches geography, AP Human Geography, and AP European Geography at Minnetonka Public Schools, will describe the problem and provide some suggestions about how teachers could handle migration in your classrooms. Jennifer is also a MAGE Steering Committee member. You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. On some devices, this podcast shows visuals, chapter controls, and clickable internet links. This podcast is directed at middle school geography teachers and addresses several Minnesota geography standards. I'm Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education.
The topic of migration in a geography classroom can be fascinating and complex. From the reasons for the movement of people to the effects these migrations have on individual countries, communities, or individuals themselves, there is a lot of material to consider. Substrand 3 of the Minnesota State Geography Standards requires teachers to expose students to the characteristics, distribution, and migration of human population on the Earth's surface. The benchmark suggests that students should be able to explain migration patterns in the modern era at a range of scales from local to global. The history of the United States has been shaped by a variety of immigrant groups, including individuals from Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. African migration to the United States has its roots in the period of forced migration due to the slave trade from the 16th to the 19th centuries. This period has been very important in shaping the history, culture, and human geography of the United States. However, rather than focusing on those significant issues, this podcast will attempt to provide very basic information on African migration to the United States and Minnesota in recent decades. Additionally, it will mention various suggestions about how the broader topic of migration might be approached in the classroom. According to the Migration Policy Institute, the African-born population in the United States grew from about 200,000 to 1.5 million from 1980 to 2009. This figure represents only about 4% of the total foreign-born population in the United States, with more individuals coming from Eastern and Western Africa. The top countries of origin include Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, and Kenya. There are a variety of reasons for this movement of African individuals, including the pull of education, jobs, and already established family members or community networks. Push factors, including political persecution and war, are also significant. In addition to studying where African immigrants in the United States are coming from and why, it is interesting to know where they are headed. Over 1/3 of all African immigrants in the United States reside in New York, California, Texas, and Maryland. In states like California and New York, African migrants make up a relatively small percentage of the total foreign-born population, unlike in North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Maryland, where the concentration is higher. Living in Minnesota for the past 18 years, it has been interesting to observe these changes. As of 2008, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy estimated that there were between 70,000 and 80,000 African immigrants in Minnesota, while that number was closer to 5,000 in 1990. 1 out of 5 immigrants living in the state of Minnesota are African. Somalis make up the largest group of African immigrants. Others come from the states of Ethiopia, Liberia, Kenya, and Nigeria. Many African immigrants settle in and around the Twin Cities. More recently, however, there has been movement to rural areas like Faribault, Owatonna, and Wilmer due to jobs in meat processing plants. When studying migration in any classroom, it is important to go beyond statistics and figures. After addressing who and where, dive into the more interesting questions of why and so what. Develop ways for students to research or read about specific push factors in Somalia, Liberia, Ethiopia, or Nigeria. Research the economic effects of immigration through the topic of remittances or entrepreneurs. Examine the effect that these groups have on the economy and the cultural landscape. The Twin Cities areas, for example, has more halal markets now than it did 15 years ago. Encourage students to visit ethnic restaurants or ethnic markets as a way of understanding cultural similarities and differences. Many communities offer services tailored to the needs of immigrants. These organizations can often provide useful information for the classroom. Read the personal stories and accounts of individuals in your community. It is especially important for students to go beyond statistics and understand the lives and experiences of others. Students in your classroom are also a good source of information about migration due to their own experiences or the experiences of people they know. While this podcast only mentions African migration to the United States, there are obviously many other regions represented when considering who is and who has migrated to this country. An interesting activity would be to do a geographic comparison of the various groups who have migrated to this country. Migration is a topic that clearly affects other parts of the world besides the United States. Consider the news headlines from 2015 that focused on refugee and migrant situation affecting Europe. European governments and aid organizations are struggling to figure out the best way to deal with the thousands of individuals who have arrived in Europe or are attempting to do so. The topic of migration in a geography classroom could also be extended to include refugee camps. Where they are located around the world and the conditions inside of these camps are interesting topics to consider. Make migration the interesting topic that it is by going beyond the basics of defining broad push and pull factors. Besides considering what was previously suggested, make as many connections as you can to other topics in your syllabus, like culture, language, religion, economic development, gender, and political geography. Hopefully this podcast inspired some thoughts about how you could do just that. Thanks for listening. Statistics in this podcast were gathered from the Migration Policy Institute, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and the United States Census Bureau. By no means is this information comprehensive. Much more information can be gathered online and tailored to the individual needs of your classroom.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a nonprofit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.